Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Second Saints. John Hendricks alongside Ross Jackson on a fine Saturday, because you don't know when we actually record and do all this fun stuff. But yeah, I will just tell you guys because people listen to the show. But Ross, man, how are you doing this fine day?
Good, man. Good. Yeah. I'm grateful for a little bit of a day of respite at the moment after what has been a crazy busy week. It's not gonna be a day off, but it's certainly a day away. So it'd be nice to just kind of like chill for a little bit. How are you holding up?
I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
I think people, if you don't know, I've been as a do not practice. I got to work on my activation period, but I've been down with a low back injury, low back tightness. So I'm questionable for Sunday, but I'm trending in the right direction. So I know
There you
everybody
go.
cares about that. But yeah, man, what a week! And I'm talking about football stuff, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
Dennis Allen gets fired, Darren Rizzi comes into play. Now we have Chris Olave going to injured reserve on Saturday.
Lattimore traded.
Lattimore traded. Like it's been a week for sure. This team doing it in season versus doing it in the off season, which that's usually when they're doing a lot of this stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
This
but
has been obviously a situation where they feel like they need major change. And this has been, if nothing else, John, the week of change for sure.
yeah, yeah. And look, you've seen the vibes. Like, I mean, Rizzi's kind of talked about all the different changes from, moving around the locker rooms to putting the position groups together. Seems like a no-brainer.
Yep.
This activation period, warming up before you practice. I mean, what a novel concept, right?
Yeah.
Like, why is it taking this to somebody to come in here to fix this thing when it probably should have been away? I mean, I guess the more you unravel and the more changes Rizzi makes, and it's clear that the players really do love Rizzi, and we
Yeah,
said
for
that, like,
sure.
he's got the players' respect or support because he's around almost all of them, but it just shows kind of how so many things were broken in a lot of ways, in my opinion.
Yeah, it really gives you kind of a peek behind the curtain. I mean, when and of course this is how it always happens too, right? Something like this happens and all of a sudden all the stories start to come out and everything and stuff. And so it's been an enlightening week so far of just an understanding of what was versus what is. Um, I have spoken to several players in the locker room, several people with the team, and they kind of love the direction that things are going. They love the way that things are feeling right now. I don't know that anybody is sort of looking at this team as a team that's going to turn itself around and win 8 straight or anything like that. They're not unrealistic in that sort of set of expectations, although they're not closing the door to that. If they can do that, they'll be happy to do that, of course. But I think the thing that they're learning right now is that like there is an ability now to kind of be a little bit more free. You can kind of feel the energies back in the locker room and everything like that. I do think that having the position groups together is a needle mover for this team in
Yeah.
terms of its culture. Even just sitting and talking to players, you'll get other players come in during because they're in the same position group and they'll just start cracking jokes while you're trying to talk to a player, and they'll be, kind of, throwing shots at one another and having fun and kind of doing all this stuff. Like it's a different vibe entirely. And John, it feels like the week heading into Philly, heading into that game, like how jovial the locker room was. They were 2-0 at the time. They had these two explosive games. They were ready to go out against Philly and everything like that. It feels like that again. And even then, I would say it still feels more fun. And
Yeah.
this is all in juxtaposition to the players also say, yeah, this is the hardest that we've practiced in, X amount of time and everything like that. The pace is up. They run everything in sort of a game simulation fashion to where they keep the 40-second clock. So while they're running plays, they're subbing in and out. There was something that Darren Rizzi noticed that they've been having trouble with. So he said, why not work it in practice? Again, novel idea and everything. Players at practice are all engaged and active and everything. And so there's just a lot of those types of things that are have kind of changed now once you get into the, what has happened here over the course of the last week.
Yeah, just something as simple as working on substitutions and just
Right.
continuing to just work it until it gets better. I mean, again, this is and the thing is, Riz comes from a Bill Parcells tree, right? So
Hmm.
discipline and accountability, all those things are bread and butter staples of what he
Yep.
brings to the table. And look, you talk about the locker room. I mean, just to give some people some perspective, you'd have Alvin on one corner, then you'd have Jamal on one side, and then Jordan Mims is way back in the other side of the thing, and then you've got other running backs that are in the mix, like Kendre's on the closer. Like, I mean, yeah, like it's just it's all and I get it. Like they did this in COVID, but why was it not done? I mean, you have some people that were close together, like Chase Young was closer to Cam Jordan and Peyton Turner,
Hmm.
but then you got Foskey way over on the other side of the locker
Yep.
room, and then and Granderson's on the other far side.
Hmm.
So I like the cohesion. I like that fact. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, right?
Yeah,
You
please.
wrote a fabulous piece, a peek
Thank
behind the
you.
curtain on LouisianaSports.net about the way they've handled Kendre Miller. And for those who
Yeah.
don't read, which you got to read some stuff. Like the thing is, don't rely on Facebook because there's a bunch of garbage. Like I saw this thing about Drew coming to GM. Like, guys, come
Oh my
on, be
gosh, I know. I got
smarter.
so many messages about
Stop. Stop
that.
it. Like the Michael Jordan, stop it. You know what I'm saying? Like, but again, that's how this misinformation comes. But at any rate, I digress. You wrote a peek behind the curtain on Kendre Miller. I'm not going to spoil it. Take it away. Talk a little bit about how that kind of happened.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and thank you, by the way, for the praise on the
Of
piece.
course.
I was really proud of that one. Yeah, I spoke to several people on this and everything, and basically, this is the way that it breaks down. Kendre Miller had an injury to the opposite hamstring up against the Los Angeles Chargers. When I say opposite hamstring, what I mean is it's not the same hamstring that sidelined him all throughout training camp and then the first 6 weeks of the season.
Mhm.
And so he had the injury on the opposite side. I was told the quote was the direct quote was that he damn near could have gone back in during the Chargers game. And so, but what they decided to do is that they were going to be cautious around it. It's kind of, similar to what they did with Marshawn Lattimore week 2, right? Hamstring
Yep.
injury. Let this be a 1 week thing, not a multi-week thing. So the plan was don't put him back in against the Chargers. Then they reevaluated him after that Chargers game. They said, you know what? We're going to play it cautious. Let's not play him during the Carolina Panthers game, but he'll be ready for the Atlanta Falcons game, which would have been this game coming up this weekend. But something happened somewhere, and Kendre Miller ends up getting placed on injured reserve. Well, that something that happened somewhere, according to multiple sources, is that Dennis Allen had a lot to do with driving this idea of putting Kendre Miller on injured reserve so that they would have that roster spot so that they can move some stuff around. But you'll remember that very weekend, they added a running back, Jordan Mims, to their active roster. So it's one of those things where you look at it and you go, okay, so really all you did was exchange and then you didn't really even use them and all these other things. So it was a bit of a roster mismanagement thing that created a lot of confusion and frustration were the two words that I was given, all aimed towards Dennis Allen, apparently. And this was coaching staff frustration, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of
And
the way that this whole thing ended up happening. And then when I asked, what was the driving factor for DA around putting Kendre Miller on injured reserve, it was described to me as a lack of trust. I want to be clear, just real quick, too, that
no,
you
go
can
ahead.
put a player with any injury, no matter the severity, on injured reserve. The Saints did
Right.
not do anything that's against the rules by putting Kendre Miller on injured reserve, but they did something that was against what the original diagnosis was and against the original expectation. And that's what created the frustration.
Yeah, and look, I think the frustration is valid. And look, we know going back to training camp, the shots that Dennis Allen took at Kendre Miller. I mean, he
Right.
practically rolled him under the bus, backed it up, and then put it over again.
Mm-hmm.
But the conversely, and again, I'm going to be very careful on how I say this. Trevor Penning was defended. He defended Derek
Right.
Carr. I don't ever hear criticism on Isaiah Foskey other than he needed to cut it loose and get more playing time. But all he's doing is playing special teams. So it's like, I don't understand why you're so frustrated and the way you basically can say, okay, well, I'll show accountability or I'll show flex my muscles as a coach with Kendre Miller, but these other players, whatever, it's all good. Like it's no
Right.
big deal. Like I just that mixed messaging is really what's concerning to me. And of course, this is
Yep.
in the past, right? But when you talk about peek behind the curtains, where I want to jump off from that is James Hurst's comment, right? Like
Yeah,
he
big one.
brought up this week on WDSU, which he's a fabulous analyst. We've always said that when James Hurst retired, I think when he retired back when we said this, that when we're doing the show, that he's going to be great for TV. And he is. He's so smart. He's all those things, great personality, but he kind of said that he thought the locker room was lost at that Falcons game at the end of the year. Like it did more damage than it let on. And he said from his perspective, because the coach didn't have their back. And it was brushed off. It was swept. It said, oh, it's not a big deal. But he said Mickey came in and talked to this team, and he never talks to the team. They thought DA might have got fired then. It didn't happen. And so, again, you create this rift. I don't know what else you would have expected when this type of direction happens, because I think you're right. The players needed to have the coaches, the support on that aspect. And like her said, get Ream behind closed doors and they'll never do it again. But to do that publicly and say that's not who we are, when you came from a coach who says, I don't care, I'm gonna run a wheel route on Alvin on fourth down against Malcolm Jenkins just to prove a point that he is who he says. But it's really interesting that the stuff that comes out after the fact that supports this decision needed to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's really, I think the only thing that was going to really be of conversation was going to be timeline, right? Like it was going to happen. Like Dennis Allen was going to be fired at the end of the season, almost regardless of what would have happened at the end of the season. Obviously, if they go on an 8-game win streak, then obviously you start talking about things differently, whatever. But that was very unlikely to happen. And it would have been an unreasonable expectation, right? You're down your top 2 corners and your top 2 wide receivers, several interior offensive linemen, your quarterback's playing hurt, like all this stuff. Like you were not going to rip off 10 straight or 8 straight. It's not going to happen. No. And so it was going to happen one way or another that Dennis Allen was going to be out and that the Saints were going to be in this new head coach search going into 2025. But doing it during the season shows you just how dramatic all of this was.
Yeah.
And when I say dramatic, I don't mean like drama inside the facility or anything like that, but like just how, let's say, drastic the performance versus the expectation gap was. And I think that's a big thing. Then you start to hear things about, I heard chatter of, how practices are now, like players are actually practicing was one of the phrases that I heard somebody use and everything like that. Like, what do you mean? You know what I mean? Like, what do you mean actually practicing? And so like, there's just like little things like that where it just sounds like a lot of things were just kind of let go. And this isn't the first time that we've heard this, right? Like we heard this from Alvin last year around, things don't get called out or whatever. We heard Tyron right before Darren Rizzi did his, we'll call it introductory press conference as interim head coach. Tyron talking about some guys just need to be told how it is or told like it is and things like that. It's like, that wasn't happening before. Like clearly it wasn't. And we've been told many times that it hasn't. Like, I mean, you've talked about Alvin Kamara before, where if you ever want to know the pulse of this team, just listen to an Alvin Kamara press conference. Go back and listen to press conferences from last year. Like Alvin was saying exactly what was going on behind closed doors, even if he wasn't saying it completely outright or using names. I think you can see the difference now between what those comments were versus Alvin just a couple of days ago.
Yeah, and his facial reaction when he was asked about was just telling. Like that said everything you needed to know. And again, nobody was saying, oh, this guy just has to get fired. Like we're not, there's a human element to obviously all of this, but 100%. If you kept him in role, you were doing too much damage to this locker room. I mean, you're looking at animosity building, and it was, again, I said 53 versus 1 in a sense, right? But it's just, it was so hard because you see all these different things that happen, and accountability, you say one thing, but practice what you preach. And the thing is, the evidence of accountability we've seen is Alante getting benched, right? Maybe pulling Nick Saldiveri. You didn't do it with any veterans, did you? I mean, you might be punishing Cam Jordan and saying, oh, he's just not going to play. Is that really accountability? Like, you just send some weird messaging the way it goes. And of course, it's easy for us to just continue to beat this dead horse. But it's just frustrating because you sat through years of this. And look, I could understand the first year. I could even understand the second year because of the quarterback shuffle, all this other stuff and different things that happened. But last year, you were supposed to be much better and you weren't. And then this year, you start with a thing of fool's gold, and then you de-evolve into 7 straight. You don't lose that many games, and then I get it, like, when you have a perspective to say, well, we lost our 2 starting cornerbacks, our 3 offensive line, all this, get better depth. Like,
Right.
isn't that part of
Right.
your job? Is injuries are going to happen, and how this team is snake bitten by injuries. Other teams can manage. Look what the Rams did. So are you
Yep.
saying that your talent scout is not where it needs to be? Like, there's just so many different things instead of just saying, well, the head coach got fired because it was on beyond his control because of the injuries. Like, that's such a cop out.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it was so much more than that. And these stories that we're sharing and
Yeah,
that, you're seeing come out, like those are all examples of the why, right? I mean,
right.
Mickey Loomis talked about how, it's not about they're trying to look past the results, meaning that they were trying to identify if there were issues in the process.
Yeah.
Clearly there are issues in the process because all these other things that we've been explaining, time management, game management, roster management, relationship management, culture management within the team, practicing, management of practice, how practice is being run, are players involved, how are players doing, are players supported? That's all process stuff. And clearly you can find flaws in each and every one of those things. And certainly you can find flaws in each and every one of those things, probably for any head coach out there. But the difference is, are those flaws surmountable, or are those flaws things that are of detriment to your team? Clearly, these were flaws that were of detriment to the team.
And every week we were told we had a great week of practice. We had a good week of practice, and look at the results. So we'll have plenty more on this game because we're actually going to talk about the Falcons and some more, obviously,
Mhm.
Chris Olave, but we'll do that right after the break. Hey, folks, John Hendricks here, Second and Saints. Wanted to talk to you quickly about Underdog because it is the place to play if you're a sports fan looking to win money while watching sports. With over 5 million happy players and $2 billion won, Underdog makes it fun and easy to cash in on all your favorite athletes' performances. Compete against other players by just selecting higher or lower on 2 or more player stats, and you could win up to 1,000 times your money. So turn every touchdown into a win with Underdog. This season, Underdog is going to be running a special promo or bonus almost every single day, like profit boosts, discounts, or free picks. Plus, all new users get a free pick. You could win up to 1,000 times your money just by choosing higher or lower on player stats like passing yards, interceptions, touchdowns, and much more. Create entries with all football selections or mix and match across your favorite sports. Underdog puts the power to cash out in your hands. Now you can either keep riding with your entry or tap the win now button to cash out whenever you want. And with Underdog Rescues, you can get your money back and receive a promo if an early injury causes your entry to lose. With Underdog's double flex option, you can even take 2 L's and still have your entry to be a win. So go download the app today and use code Second Saints to get up to $1,000 in bonus cash instantly. That's code Second Saints. Now here comes the legal jargon. Must be 18 or older, 19 and older in Alabama and Nebraska, 19 and older in Colorado for some games, 21 and older in Massachusetts and Arizona, and present in the state where Underdog Fantasy operates. Terms apply. Void in Colorado. Concerned with your play? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit www.ncpgambling.org. Arizona, 1-800-NEXT-STEP, 1-800-639-8783, or text NEXT STEP to 53342. New York, call the 24/7 Hope line at 1-877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. Back here on Second and Saints, John Hendricks alongside Ross Jackson. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, folks. And we appreciate all the support that you guys give us. Ross, we were talking a lot about the past and what kind of has changed for this Saints team. And obviously a big one now, we got to talk about Chris Olave going to injured reserve. We're not really surprised by that because of everything, but second concussion in less than a month, third concussion in less than a year. Short term, 4 games minimum, but we'd be surprised if we see him at all because this team is not in a playoff position. And I think he needs to do what's best for him. But, again, not surprising that he goes there. But talk about Olave a little bit and then the depth that the Saints team has because they don't have anybody really.
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because you're not just talking about losing Chris Olave from a football perspective. You're also talking about already having lost Rashid Shaheed for the rest of the season, who underwent meniscus surgery. They had to do a total repair on that. So he's already done for the year. So the depth looks a little bit different for or rather, not even depth. The top of the wide receiver room looks a little bit different for this team. There's no doubt about that. But before we get to the football side of it, let's talk about the Chris Olave side of it, right? Like, this is something that Darren Rizzi was really adamant about all throughout the week, that they're worried about Chris Olave, the person, not Chris Olave, the player. And so what he means by that is that he's more concerned, and the organization is more concerned with Chris Olave's long-term health. Unfortunately, this organization has been through something like this before. With people will remember defensive back Damian Swan, who had several concussions, and his was really scary. Like, his was like the moment that he stepped back on a football field, this was becoming a consistent issue and stuff like that. And we're starting to see something like that here with Olave, who has had 4 confirmed concussions since his 3 years in the NFL. And he was also checked for one in Los Angeles going up against the Chargers. So that one was not a confirmed concussion, but something happened there that at least spawned the, independent neurological, person to go and assess and do a check. So this is something that makes sense, and that is the right decision for the New Orleans Saints, and it's the right decision for Chris Olave. Darren Rizzi says that he's been visiting with specialists. He's kind of going through a process through all this. That process is separate from concussion protocol. This is a process of him going to go and see, what do I need to do in order to prevent this in the future? So things like, what maybe looking at helmets, maybe looking at guardian caps. There was a time where we thought he was going to wear a guardian cap in that game up against the Carolina Panthers. Neck strength, all these other things that kind of help in these situations. He's got to work on all that, turn his eyes towards 2025. For the Saints in the short term, it's not a very deep wide receiver room all of a sudden. They're going to have to bring somebody up from the practice squad. But when it comes to what you're looking at on the active roster, you've got Cedric Wilson Jr., you've got Marquez Valdez-Scantling, who just joined a couple weeks ago, and you've got rookie Mason Tipton. Remember, you've also got Bub Means, but he's on injured reserve. And then, as we mentioned, you've got, Olave and Shaheed, who are both kind of done for the season. You've got guys that are on the practice squad as well, and Kevin Austin Jr., Equanimeous St. Brown, Jermaine Jackson's on the active roster, and then you've got Dante Pettis in that practice squad as well. So I assume that once they do move Chris Olave to injured reserve, which is what we expect later on Saturday, that one of those players will be signed to the active roster, probably Equanimeous St. Brown. If I had to, venture a guess.
Sure.
And then those are going to be the guys that you're probably going to walk in with by the time that the game rolls around on Sunday. But that's kind of where things stand when it comes to wide receivers. It's not going to be a very top heavy wide receiver room. There's some talent there, but it's not the same as having Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed out on the field, which we won't see again for the rest of the season.
Yeah, and Cedric Wilson Jr. is out, right? So they have
That's
3
right.
healthy
Yeah,
receivers on the roster right now going into Sunday's game against Atlanta. And they're already going to have to figure out some other things from the practice squad. So it's just like, and they got to figure out, Nephi Sewell is not probably going to return this week, but Will Harris and Shane Lemieux probably return from IR. I say probably, they are returning from IR this week. And so they got to figure out the roster shuffles on that. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But look, you said it a couple of days or a couple of episodes ago that the wide receiver is probably one of those picks that you look at in the first round. And but I got to tell you, that's looking more evident now than ever. Like, I know they got to rebuild the trenches. I know they got to do the trenches, but they got to give this wide receiver room some attention. And I get it. The undrafted stuff, that's feel good stories and all this, but Tipton's not getting a lot of opportunities. Bub Means wasn't getting as many, right? Like, he was inactive. And then when Rattler was quarterback, he started getting a little bit more looks and all this other stuff. And so I like that. But, if I'm a fan, it's like, why isn't a Samson Nakua here? You know what I mean? And I'm just saying that out loud. I'm not saying that they should have Samson Nakua, but like, this is a guy that we saw in training camp that I thought did pretty well. Why don't you look at a Shaq Davis again? There's other things that you could look at for this, but man, they're rolling out a wide receiver room that's just, now it's a little bit more elderly, and I say that with all respect because it's just more seasoned, maybe, I guess you could say. But they're not Chris Olave, they're not Rashid Shaheed, so they're going to have to figure out a way to do it. We know that they got it done on the ground last week, and Atlanta's going to pose a nice little challenge as far as running the football. Taysom Hill's going to be in there, Alvin Kamara, he's going to break the record for all-time leading rusher. He doesn't need a lot of yards. He's going to break Mark's record in front of the home crowd that does show up. I don't expect a ton, but this is a thing where offensively, what do they have to do to beat the Falcons? And can they generate enough with just what they got on the ground, being that they won't have Lucas Patrick? They're going to have to make a change there. Eric McCoy is not ready yet either.
Yeah. It's
I
tough.
stumped Ross. We don't know. No.
No. Look, it's going to be tough, right? Because like the thing that becomes really challenging about this is that, like, we can look at the things that maybe this team has to do to try to curb, the Atlanta Falcons, but most of it's got to happen on the defensive side. Most of it's got to be stop the run. And improve there. Speaking of changes, how about the Saints? How about Darren Rizzi moving Todd Grantham off of the defensive line, having him be now kind of the senior defensive advisor, helping to help plan the run game, along with linebackers coach Michael Hodges. So a little bit of an elevation, it sounds like, in terms of responsibility there. And then now Brian Young, the former New Orleans Saints defensive lineman, who's been with the team for like 15 years, is now working with the defensive line. So do we see something different with the defensive line? We'll find out. So that's got to be number one, is can you stop the run? And then after that, can you make Kirk Cousins move off of his first read? Can you make a move off of his second read? Can you force him to hold the football? And if you do that, can you get to Kirk Cousins, or can you force Kirk Cousins to make a bad throw and make him pay for it? So like those are things that I think you're going to have to see. It's not really going to come down to like, oh, what does the Saints offense do? Saints offense needs to just use Taysom Hill. Taysom Hill had 2 touchdowns against Atlanta last week. Taysom Hill seems to score like 83 touchdowns every time he plays against Atlanta. Just give him the damn ball and then let him be the guy along with Alvin Kamara, and then play solid defense. And I think that that's really what you're looking for. I think Marquez Valdes-Scantling maybe gets a little bit of a bad rap because he's got like a less than 50% career completion percentage and all these other things. And, he's got some dropsies and all that. I get all that, but I think that your ability to utilize him downfield has to be something that this team gets back into the fold. And then maybe, John, you remember during training camp, all the conversation around Mason Tipton is that he's more than a deep threat, more than a deep threat, more than a deep threat, more than 3 deep threats. So then why doesn't he have a single target this season between 10 to 19 yards? Everything that he's been targeted with so far has been between 0 to 9, which is the majority. I think he's got like 14 catches on 17 targets there, if I recall correctly. And then the rest of his targets have been 20 plus yards downfield. None of them caught. If everything was about how good a route runner he is, then let him run some routes and then actually target him in the intermediate area and give him a chance to do something. So I think that like those are the 2 guys that I'm really looking at as like, okay, they're going to have to be your impact players in the receiving game at wide receiver. And then you got to get the tight ends going. But really, I think honestly, this game, if the Saints want any opportunity to be able to compete in it, like truly compete in it, which I think that they will compete, they've got to do it through what they do on defense.
Yeah, I mean, make no mistake about it. They're going to come up with some energy. They're going to come play. But when you just look at the deficiencies on the roster, wide receiver being one of them, corner situation still kind of being a little bit questionable there. I mean, and then your pass rush just not getting it going. I mean, there's certain elements in this that you say, I don't know if it's enough, right? Like, I mean, Falcons still have a very talented defense. I mean, for all intents and purposes, they look like kind of the team to beat. Them and Tampa and I said this at the beginning of the year, I thought Tampa would be the top of the division because they're the returning, defending champs. But Falcons, if they can prove that they can not collapse down the line, then I think they have a good shot at it. But, for the Saints, it's a tall task, and I know they're playing at home. I know that there's a lot of energy there. I just don't know if it's enough. That's the thing. When it's all said and done, I think you can have the energy, you can execute, you can do all these things. But when you look at talent versus talent and the deficiencies the Saints have right now, I just don't think it's there. Right. And I think they can move the football, but I think now, since they moved off of Allen, it puts everybody in the spotlight. Like I know you and I've talked about this, is I'm in favor of seeing this offensive staff stay together. It depends on what they bring in the offseason with a new coach. But, this is their audition for the defense. A lot of these guys were handpicked by Dennis Allen. This is their audition. Like, everybody's coaching for the job and everybody's playing for the job right now. And so I think they can do it. I think Joe Woods is very capable as a defensive coordinator. And, we'll see. I mean, this is going to be a big proving ground for a lot of people.
Big time. And this is huge for Darren Rizzi, right? Like, this is an 8-game audition for him too, for a potential head coach. Remember, the Saints interviewed him before the 2022 season where they eventually would hire Dennis Allen, which we knew they were going to hire Dennis Allen. But like, the Saints can make this very simple, because as an interim head coach, you don't have to interview outside candidates. You don't have to satisfy the Rooney Rule. You don't have to do any of that stuff. You can just appoint the interim head coach as your head coach, said and done. I don't think they should do that. I think that they should open the search, interview, do the whole search, everything like that. But if Rizzi can convince you that much, he's got 8 games to do it. I don't think that that's realistic based upon the talent that's left on the roster at the moment and all the other stuff. But like, still, it's an important 8 games, and I think it's an important 8 games for this team in terms of building out its future building blocks too. Like, who are the people that you build around moving forward? You know, some of them when Chris Olave's back. Chris Olave is obviously in that conversation. Shahid's in that conversation. Taliyasi Fuang is in that conversation. Trevor Penning has played he has more than halved his pressure rate from last year at left tackle, or for his career at left tackle, to this year at right tackle. So like, you know, you've got some pieces. Eric McCoy, you know, you've got some pieces, but who are the other guys that you're building around? And I'll tell you, the player I am singularly most excited to watch this weekend, that no one will be surprised to hear me utter the name of, is Alontae Taylor. You and I have talked so much about how he was the most improved player throughout training camp. I think we both were on the same page that he was one of the 3 best players on this team going through the early portion of the season. I'd have to say like Alvin, Shahid, and then him in the early portions of the season. Not necessarily in that order, but whatever. I'm excited to see him playing at, you know, his natural position and everything. Like, there's a lot of talk in the building that he's the next great New Orleans Saints cornerback. Like, people are very excited about seeing Alontae in his position and seeing him finally not having to be kind of shoehorned in the slot and placed somewhere else. And Alontae is really excited to prove it too. I mean, he had a wonderful media availability over in the locker room. If you haven't seen that, you can find it on the Saints website. But like, fantastic. And you can just sort of feel the charge from him, how excited he is. Here's an opportunity for him to prove that he can be CB1 in New Orleans. He's got a little tattoo in the back of his ear that says, "I'm him." He gets a chance to prove that. Like, that's what he's going to be doing over the course of these last 8 games. And so I'm excited to see him against a veteran quarterback, solid pass catchers against in Atlanta. I'm really excited to see him this week too.
Yeah, I agree. And look, we've played this. I mean, go back a couple episodes. We've played this out. Like, Rizzi, if he does like 5-3 or better, I think you have to look at him really as a coach. But if he can get 4-4, I think that's probably a win. And for Alontae, look, you know, right now it's him and Kool-Aid McKinstry that are the future of this team. Like, they could get Paulson Adebo back on a relatively friendly contract, I feel like, being that he's coming off of a major injury. But again, that rehab, I think it's probably going to be a longer one, you know. So does that some direction that you want to go? I think for all intents and purposes, Alontae and Kool-Aid should be your 1 and 2 duo next year. And then we'll see what kind of shakes out there. I want to see more of Rico Payton. I want to see him because he had he went from being a tough training camp to start. Then he really picked it up on the back half. He played well in the preseason, and he made this roster because of what he's able to do, especially on special teams. And so there's a lot of these players that I'm interested to see more of. And again, it begs the question, when whoever runs the defense next year, do they still play a lot of nickel? Do they play more base? Do they do different looks? Because we knew what Dennis Allen's defense was going to be and what they were going to create and such. How does that change? And Alontae probably doesn't have to go back into the slot regardless of what happens. He should stay on the outside. That's what he's wanted to do all the time. He embraced being a slot guy. I think he played extremely well there in the slot this year. And then now he gets a chance to shine on the outside. And so it's a lot of evaluation for a lot of players, but I think it's also exciting for a lot of players because now they get to say, let's see what we really got here in this future. And look, I put a piece up on Saints News Network yesterday or on Friday, just kind of assessing the entire future of this team. Like, what makes this team attractive for a new head coach comes in. And look, there's a lot of things to talk about. And we said this exercise, we can go down to offense, defense later. The salary cap is a thing, who they play next year, all these different things. But Alontae is a good building block on defense. I think Pete Werner is probably underrated building block on the defense. I think Brian Brzee is an underrated building block on the defense. I think they have some at each position, but there's still a lot to be done. And being that they got those draft picks from Washington now, they've got 5-6 picks in the top 150, presumably, depending on how things work out. But they have a chance to make this right. It's just a question of who's going to do it and who's going to run it.
Yeah. And for anybody wondering, because I know Washington had 2 third-round picks, one that could be Phillies, could be Miami's. Washington's got a bunch of weird, confusing picks. That are like, it could be this, or like the Steelers could be involved, or the Falcons could be, they have a whole thing. But they traded their original 3rd round pick, which is going to be a late 3rd round pick, but still, as John highlights, it is yet another selection in the top around 150. It's what, 5 selections in the first 4 rounds, which is good, or 6 selections in the first 4 rounds, right? First, second, third,
2
fourth,
thirds,
fourth.
2
Yeah.
full fourths.
Yeah. So 6 selections in the first 4 rounds. That's outstanding. That's really, really good. And so that puts them in a really good position. And understand that when we talk about players being building blocks, doesn't necessarily mean that they're the top player at that position and everything. And so even if, they look at Bryan Bresee as a building block, but then they draft I'm just going to throw a name out there, like a TJ Sanders out of South Carolina, everything like that. TJ Sanders could become the top defensive tackle, but then your second defensive tackle is really, really good in Bryan Bresee, especially as a pressure player and everything like that. But you got to get better in your run defense, all these other things. And so, these building blocks are the pieces that create a solid roster. And I think that there are examples of young players. I agree with you, John, that you do have, and everything. They're excited about Rico Payton too. I'll say that as well.
Oh, of course.
They're like, it's hard not to be.
Yeah, there's a lot of guys, especially on the practice squad. Like, you look at the path of Anthony Orji. Like, this is a guy that was a practice squad guy. He just worked, and then he really turned it on in training camp. I mean, they have that type of ability on some of these guys at the practice squad now. And I think, like, when you look at the future, you shouldn't sleep on a guy like Orji, and think that there's other guys on this practice squad. Like you pointed out, and we talked about this long ago in the undrafted rookie process, but Isaiah Stallbird getting some looks at safety. Yep. He was a hybrid guy, and he was one of my guys in camp because I just loved the fact that he had that versatility. I kind of said the Sua Cravens comp before it became a thing and stuff, but I think they really love him on special teams. He's a Rizzi favorite player. I know that for sure, but you get to see more of these guys potentially next year. And I just think that it's imperative that they get this talent right, because you can have a shorter rebuild time for this team. Like, you could potentially do what Houston did under DeMeco Ryans, but I don't know if that's the path that you necessarily take, because there's so much importance on getting the right quarterback, getting the right scheme, getting the right defensive coordinator. Like, there's all sorts of things that have to line up perfectly for you to be able to get there. I think it might take a little bit longer than a year, obviously. Like, I don't expect them to come out and be gangbusters next season, hopefully better, but maybe it looks like a 7-10 at best, you know what I mean? But it depends on who's in your building, who you get to replace Dennis Allen, who gets to run the defense. Like, there's just so many domino effects from all this, but I think they have a good nucleus of players to be able to get it done.
Yeah, I think your rebuild examples are Houston, Washington. You throw Detroit in there. Detroit took longer. I think Houston and Washington expected to take longer. Washington's definitely a year early. No one expected Washington. Everyone thought it was worst offensive line in the NFL. Like, nobody thought that Washington was going to be where they are immediately, outside of maybe Washington themselves. But I think they're even surprised in the first year with a new head coach and Dan Quinn, and then Jaden Daniels, who should have been 1-1, and all these other things. Like, all these pieces, like, that all ended up falling into place. And I'll tell you what, you mentioned Isaiah Stallbird and how much they like him. If you want any example of how much they like Isaiah Stallbird, he's already, all 3 of his elevations are already used, and he is still on the practice squad. And you look at a Jonathan Abram, once all 3 of those elevations were utilized, he was gone. He was out the door and everything. And so that's something that really kind of is indicative of how much they like Isaiah Stallbird, that he is not only still on the roster, he's got a vested year as a UDFA. He's got 3 elevations, which means they can't elevate him anymore, is why I say that that's important. But yet they've kept him around, and they've started working him at other positions. It just shows you how much, like, that's real buy-in on that player.
Yeah, no doubt. All right, Ross. So this game, we've kind of talked a little bit about it, and I don't know what fans are going to expect in this one, right? Like, I think there's a certain energy that can come with this one, but who ends up winning this game? Does New Orleans pull off the upset, or is it going to be the 8th straight loss for this team?
I'm going to do something I rarely ever do. I'm going to pick the Saints.
Okay.
I just think that, like, the 1 game bump for the interim head coach has been up and down in the NFL as of recent years. But if you look at the Falcons, for whatever reason, they fall victim to the 1 game bump on the interim head coach a lot. And they fall victim to the interim head coach quite a bit. So I think that them coming to New Orleans, a little bit of a rejuvenated energy for this team, hopefully a rejuvenated energy for the fan base, because I think that a lot of the fan base was not going to show up if Dennis Allen was still the head coach this weekend. I think that is absolutely true. But there is a part of me that is curious if now that the changes have been made, now the energy is different, now that the expectations are different as well, that maybe the Saints fans show up. And if that happens, I think that it becomes a little bit tougher for Atlanta. And I don't know, just being around this Saints team, it's an infectious energy right now. I think that they can benefit from that. So I'm going to do what I rarely do, and I'm going to pick the Saints to actually win in what would be a pretty major upset and a pretty definitive statement from where this team has been, which is a team that has not beaten the team with a better record with its original quarterback, with its starting quarterback in the last 2.5 seasons under Dennis Allen, and then instead becoming a team that gets that done immediately after Dennis Allen.
Yeah, I think they've come out more polished, and for me, the same thing I've been harping on for I don't know how many weeks. Start better. I think they get a better start in this game. I think they actually get the start that they want off of this one. I think that they can surprise the Falcons and kind of throw them a couple of haymakers early. I'm with you. I'm going to ride the interim energy right now. I think that they can pull off the upset here. Now, I think it's going to be closer. I don't think they're just going to go blow them out, blow the doors off of them.
No.
I think it's going to be a pretty closer game. I think they're going to ride some of the early success. I think they can jump out to a 10-point lead early. And then, Falcons will kind of go back and forth here. I'm going to take them. I think they can put up 27 points, and then Falcons probably about a 21, 24 maybe. I think it's going to be a little bit closer, but I do think the Saints can pull off the upset this weekend for whatever reason. Not just the interim success, but now that they've got the energy behind them and the fact that, now that they changed everything, like it's not just lip service, it's actually action, I feel like. And I think that's what we'll probably see on Sunday. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agreed. And I'm going to be honest with you too. Like, even if they lose, it's not for me it's not fodder for disappointment. Then you start to look at, okay, well, right. There's that for sure. But then there's also like, how did the individual players that are the building blocks for your future look? How did the offense look? Were you able to adjust? How did the defense look? Like all these other things. I think there's interior elements to the game that are still going to be good positives throughout, even if they do lose the matchup, everything like that. So I don't think that this is only a game of value if they win. I think that there's value in this game from minute 1 to minute 60 or more in this one that become really important for what this team can turn into in its future.
Yeah, it's just an added bonus if you get a win, right? Because this is an evaluation period or anything like that. Yeah, it's LAGNIAPPE. It's all that fun stuff. And so that's the way I'd look at it is it is a chance to hone in on some of these younger players, see what you got, because this is a 3-month process, right? Like you've got November, December, and January, and then presumably your season's over. So you get to evaluate all these players and all these games, all these coaches, and then see what you have and look if that leads to what your record is at the end of the year. At least you knew that this team had a much better fight than what it did with its predecessor, and so that's kind of what I look at. And so and it's very telling. And look, DL be fine. We say it. If he ends up in Denver, that'd be the least shocking move. Like if I was putting betting odds on it, it's probably like a minus 3,000 or something. Like that's probably just what's going to happen. Some type of role for him, but when he does come back to coaching. Well, Ross, what you got coming up on LouisianaSports.net and what's coming up on Locked On, man?
Yeah, so I am actually going to do – so this is what I usually do whenever the team starts being bad towards the end of the season over the course of the past few years, is that I start doing like episodes that are like hey, here's what's going on now, but then also here's another episode that's like looking ahead to the future. So what I'm going to do today is I'm also going to do a mock draft episode. So I got the first 5 rounds scheduled out a mock draft, did the whole thing and everything. And so I'm going to break down a little bit of a mock just for fun. Like it's not serious. It's freaking November. You know what I mean?
Right.
But like, we'll dive into it and just kind of start looking at those prospects and everything. And then over at LouisianaSports.net, I have my 5 things to know going into this matchup, just a little bit of a primer that's coming up. And then I have a little bit of an exclusive with Isaiah Stallbird and his transition over to safety and kind of like how that came about, how he's feeling about it, things like that. Nothing too, earth shattering or anything like that, but it's just cool to get his perspective on that move and that change and stuff like that. So I'm super excited to be able to put that out because, you and I have been, you in particular, but like you and I have been very like supportive of this guy just because like he's just such a good dude and everything, just like good dad, good, like just good everything. And it's just good to see that. So it just felt like a feel good story would be nice at this point in time. So, so that'll be up over at Louisiana Sports Center. The mock draft to be over at Locked On Saints. What you got coming up over at Saints News Network?
Yeah, look, I'll say this. You know me, I'm not a big mock draft guy, but with the team's direction and everything, I got to change that mentality and philosophy now because, I'm always like, free agency and all this stuff. But now it's one of those things where it's valid. Like, it's not necessarily the thing I've always said. It's not about the player. It's about the position and the reasoning behind it. That's usually more of my, the bonus on a mock draft from my perspective is familiarize yourself with the prospect, but here's what the thought process of the team should be. Like when you said wide receiver, I'm on board with that given how things are going. I could see realistically with the current guard that it's offensive line or defensive line. Like that's the easy pick to make. And you hit on Taliesin Fuanga. I mean, but I don't think you draft an interior offensive lineman at your first round pick. I think it's got to be edge, interior, or like I said, skill position, wide receiver. I think that makes a lot of sense. And so, but I say all that to say, look, we're going to keep looking at some of this again. Check out that Saints News Network piece on kind of assessing the future. That was the big one
excellent
that I
piece,
came up with. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's
awesome.
Just in-depth look from the salary cap to draft picks to different building blocks, how they can navigate the salary cap, because everybody's going to take their victory lap about, well, now the Saints have, this is what they get for doing all their mismanagement. Like, you still realize they're going to clear $45 million with top 8 hits just like that. And they don't even have to touch Derek Carr, and they don't have to figure out this stuff with Ryan Ramczyk. Like, they're going to clear the money. The problem is the criticism is valid when it doesn't work. I get that.
Right.
But the way and their philosophy behind it is something that people just don't understand. They just don't get, because they just want to say, well, they're in cap hell, because it's the easy way to go.
Easy way to say it.
Right. So, but at any rate, so look at that. And then we're going to look plenty of stuff in the future. And then of course, all the game coverage and stuff. So, but any rate, Ross, time flies as always on this episode. Man, appreciate you as always. Guys, don't forget to hit that like, subscribe button, go support Ross and all his endeavors, and check us out. Again, tell everybody about it. We're again on these different social platforms now too, just to include everybody, right? So we're on Blue Sky. We're on Threads, all that other stuff. We're going to put some more content on there. And it's just because, look, you got to know your audience in some aspects. And so, look, everybody gets their news from somewhere. As long as it's not Facebook, it should be okay. But, I'm telling you, I'm not going to get off that soapbox ever.
I love it.
Like, people saying that a UK piece is like credible. Come on, guys. Stop.
I'll tell you, if you want a UK piece to check out, though, I will say the NFL Ireland guys did a feature, but they were here, boots on the ground at the facility, and did a one-on-one interview with Charlie Smith, the undrafted free agent Irish kicker, and it's really cool. So it's super exciting.
Yes. Okay. And so one of the many things, like, there's exceptions to the rule, but again, most generally it's fake news. So that's the best way to tell you. So anyway. All right, guys, that's going to do it for us. Thank you so much for supporting us. And we will talk at you post game tomorrow, Sunday. We'll see what happens with this Falcons thing. Have a good one, guys. Thanks so much. Appreciate you.
Love you.